So before I start, I want to do a couple of things. I first want to acknowledge that we are on unceded Musqueam territory, because I think that where we speak is as important as what we say. So I want to acknowledge the land that we're on. And I also would want to invite everyone to take a nice, big, deep breath together. So just breathe in and breathe out. Because I want to acknowledge that some of the things that I'm going to be talking about might not necessarily be easy to listen to. And if I'm being honest and vulnerable with you, they're not that easy to talk about. So if I asked you to tell me what a weapon looks like, I imagine that you might tell me that it looks like a gun, possibly like a knife, or maybe even like a fist. And if I asked you to think about the types of injuries that those weapons can inflict, I imagine that you might tell me about cuts and bruises, stab wounds, bullet wounds. Injuries that are physical, ones that are visible, and obviously ones that can be so severe as to be deadly. But when it comes to sexual violence, and here I mean the whole spectrum from street harassment to work harassment all the way to rape, I believe that there's one type of weapon which is the most commonly used, and it's also one of the most effective. Now, interestingly enough, it's not only used by the people who perpetrate these crimes, but also by the members of society and the groups who seek to minimize the impact that it has in our society, or to try and justify why it happens, to dismiss it entirely, and ultimately to shame, blame, or silence victims. The weapon that I'm talking about is language. It's words. So as a doctoral candidate in the Department of English, it's my job to work with words every day. And I think about how they work, why they work, and what we do with them. So when I'm in my classroom and I'm talking to my students, often we talk about how language can be amazing. We can create beautiful poetry, landscapes. All of us know what it feels like to be taken away into another world for a couple of hours when we're reading a good book. But words also have a darker side, a side that we might not want to talk about. Now, I'm sure that most of us, when we grew up, we were told that sticks and stones can break our bones, but that words will never hurt us. And I'm also pretty sure that we all learned fairly early on, probably when we were young, that this isn't exactly true. So all of us have heard different words that were designed to hurt us, whether they were racist or homophobic, transphobic, ableist, whether they were words that made fun of disability, mental illness, economic backgrounds. So I think that we all know what it's like to be injured by words. What I'm going to do today is share 3 of the insights that I've had about how language and sexual violence are connected, both from my professional experience and also my personal experience. So there are 3 things that I'm going to share with you. The first is a story about how perpetrators use use language in order to lure, to trap, and to harm their victims. So that's the first kind of injury. The next thing that I'm going to share with you is how bystanders use words to harm victims after an assault. So we call this victim blaming, and this is probably the biggest form in which language is used as a weapon. But the last thing that I'm going to share with you is how we can all use language and reclaim words to help address this epidemic. Because I firmly believe that if words can be used as weapons, then they can also be used as counterweapons, and more than that, as tools for healing and for education. So I'm going to start off with a story and talk about the first time that I was injured with language. It's the fall of 2002, and I'm 15 years old, and I'm getting ready to start grade 11. Now, I am super excited because I just got my first big role in the school musical, and I was excited for all of my courses, even math and even biology. And there's also a boy in my life at this time, and we'll call him Jack. Now, what you need to understand is that up until that point, I'd never been very popular. I'd skipped a grade, and because I was more interested in schoolwork than socializing, I was kind of a prime target for bullying. And I'd certainly never had any attention from boys. So when Jack started telling me that I was kind and nice and pretty and intelligent, my ears perked up, as anyone's would when they start hearing compliments. So we struck up a friendship. Eventually, however, his kind words started to be accompanied by actions that weren't so kind. So he started to make comments about my body, and he would touch me inappropriately, certainly without my consent. And when I said that I was uncomfortable, he told me, "But we're just friends. You don't have to worry about it so much." Because he was using language to justify what he was doing, I certainly didn't feel like I could say anything back. Eventually, however, the words and the actions took a different turn. He was no longer telling me that I was his friend. He was calling me a bitch and a whore, and he was telling me that if I didn't do what he wanted me to do, that he would make my life very difficult, and that nobody would believe me. And he'd also told me stories before how he'd gotten into fights, and he had a temper that could explode just like that. Without ever raising a fist to me, he put me into such a state of fear. And it's within the state of fear that he created, through his words, that he abused me for almost 4 months. Now, if you had asked me at that moment if I thought that I was being abused, I probably would have told you no. You see, up until that moment, I'd thought that sexual violence only occurs when a stranger attacks you. I didn't realize that 70 to 80% of victims know their perpetrators. These are people who have forged a relationship with them. I also didn't realize that sexual violence didn't only occur when somebody had a gun to your head, or a knife to your throat, or used their fists against you. I didn't realize that words could be used as a tool to humiliate and terrify. So after Jack graduated, I was very confused, and I felt really ashamed, and I didn't talk to anybody for a whole year. But then I remembered something else that I'd been told when I was little. When something bad happens, tell an adult. And so I did. Now, I was too afraid to tell my family because I didn't want them to worry about me. So I told somebody, a trusted teacher. I was really hopeful, and maybe it's because I'd watched far too many episodes of Law & Order SVU, but I thought that the response that I would get would be kind and empathetic. I thought that I would be told, "You know, Lucia, you're not going crazy, and this isn't your fault, and I believe you." But this is all that I got. Complete silence. A few years later, when I confronted this person and asked them why they hadn't said anything or done anything, they said, "Well, you know, Lucia, boys will be boys. And that's a very serious allegation to make." As if I'd said that he'd stolen my lunch money or something. That was the second way in which I was wounded by language. Sexual assault, or any assault, is what we call a primary form of wounding. But what happens afterwards in the ways that victims are treated and the things that we say to them, that's a secondary form of wounding. And because it often comes from people that we trust or love or people that we hope will support us, it can sometimes hurt even more. From my own experience and from all the memoirs that I study and from all the survivor narratives that I look at, this is one of the reoccurring themes, that it's what people say afterwards that hurts the most. And certainly I wasn't alone. Victims hear this all the time. People will ask, "What were you wearing? Why did you drink so much? Why were you walking late at night? Why did you get in his car? She couldn't have done that to you. I think that maybe you're exaggerating." Victims hear this all the time, and this is one of the main ways in which language can just hurt, like 1,000 tiny cuts all over your body. So what do we do? How do we reclaim language and use it as a force for good? Now, TED Talks are all about technology, education, and design. And I think it's within education that we can see that language can be used most effectively. Now, education about sexual violence has a lot of different facets. Obviously, it means thinking about what it means, debunking some of the myths about sexual violence, seeking out resources, and there are a lot of great resources out there. We happen to live in a time where we can just do a quick Google search and we can find tons of fascinating and helpful resources for us to know a little bit more about what it is. Education means also reflecting on the language that we use. Certainly, I know that in my research and in my time, I've started to really think about how the language of violence is really normalized in our culture. we hear jokes. We even see the tropes of sexual violence being used to sell things in advertisements. So once we've used our education to learn and think about our language, one of the next things that we can do is to start speaking about it. We can have conversations about things like consent, and not just talking about consent and sexuality with our youth, with our students, with our children, but also negotiating it with our partners. We can start speaking up and calling people out, and we can do so gently. We can say, hey, that joke about rape isn't quite so funny. Or, I don't think it's okay to say that the victim asked for it. And I understand that this is scary. In the past few years, as I've started to speak up and share my story, it's been really difficult, and sometimes I don't even feel like I want to speak. I had a lot of anxiety about coming here today. But why speak? Why use our words? When we raise our voices in a chorus to say that sexual violence is not something that we will tolerate, it sends a big message, not only to the perpetrators, to tell them that we will not stand for this in our communities, but it sends an even bigger message to victims, to survivors, to tell them that they are not alone. Some of the words have been simple, the ones that have helped me heal. Small phrases, little things. I believe you. I hear you. Little words. They don't have to be big sentences. Language is something that we all use every single day, no matter in which form that we communicate. And I think sometimes because we use it all of the time, we forget how harmful it can be, how powerful it can be. And maybe we also forget how useful it can be, how one small word, one voice raised can make a huge difference. So I want to encourage all of us to keep this conversation going, to talk about sexualized violence. It's still very taboo in many ways, it's still very silenced, but I do believe that by using our words, we can really start to make a difference. Thank you.